and our featured speaker tonight. We are very excited to get a expert of gulls, and it's. I'll admit I am very poor on gulls, and I think I got people shaking their heads here. So so tonight we're going to have Amir Ayyash. He's both expert in gulls and evangelist for gull recreation. He coordinates the Illinois Ornithological Society annual gull frolic on Lake Michigan. He hosts a popular website, Anything Laris, and I just did a little bit of perusing on that. Go check that out. It's kind of fun. Some good quizzes, and you will definitely be smarter afterwards than you were before you went on there. So, and he's often found speaking at birding events throughout the continent. Much of his free time is dedicated to traveling the world to photograph and study gulls. He has published a number of papers and articles on gulls identification, distribution, and molt. He's author of the upcoming book and the Gull Guide. Amir lives in Northern Illinois, where he teaches mathematics. So with that, let's... Amir?
Hey, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me well? All right. And my slide looks good here. Everybody's looking at a fancy gull with black legs. Okay, I see some head nods. Thank you. It's a pleasure and honor for me to be speaking with you guys tonight. This is a great time of year to be thinking about gulls. Gull season is upon us. I generally think of gull season as from late September through about early April. That's a big part of the year. And the farther north you go, the longer gull season is. And so people in places like Green Bay will get the tail end of spring migration longer than we do generally in the Chicago region. I live about 30 miles outside of the Chicagoland area. I spend most of my time birding around Lake Michigan, but I also do a good amount of traveling, not just around the US, but also in Canada and around the world. I got this gull bug probably, I don't know, going on 20 years now. And I kind of just put every other bird group aside and decided I was going to focus on gulls and learn everything about gulls. And with that came the culmination of this book project, the Gull Guide. This book took me about 5.5 years to put together. It's through Princeton University, and it's some 500 plus pages of gull identification, an introduction to how you can approach gull ID, but also just very detailed overviews of our gulls, how they feed, their ecology, their life histories, their conservation concerns. So a lot is in this book beside just identification, although the focus is identification of gulls of North America. Incidentally, the cover bird that you see on the slide here and here are of the same individual. This is a black-legged kittiwake. Black-legged kittiwake is truly a pelagic seagull, so it is perfectly fine to call this a seagull. They nest seaside on cliffs. They spend most of their life out over the ocean. This is the most abundant gull in the world. There's close to what's believed to be about 20 million black-legged kittiwakes in the world. They nest around the Arctic Circle. In about the last 30 years, we're finding that they're shifting slightly south. They're nesting farther and farther south now on man-made structures. There's places in Europe where they're now nesting on windowsills and rooftops, if you can believe that. Here on the Great Lakes, it's still a rarity. It's still a very good bird to see. On Lake Michigan, we might see, 3 or 4 every year. Typically, November tends to be the best month for them. They come down, they figure out they're in the wrong place, and then they get out of here. So they're usually not here throughout the winter unless they have a good food source or they're not healthy and just can't mobilize. Um, but this individual here was found in the um, birding gem of the Chicago lakefront, Montrose Harbor. Maybe you've heard of Montrose, but this bird became very lethargic. It was very clear something was wrong with it. So we retrieved this individual and it ended up dying the next day, which is just another indication that when these pelagic gulls make it this far south to the freshwater, they usually don't fare too well. So, as far as identification, I think that's the focus of tonight's talk. We want to learn a little bit about bird ID and gull ID. But I'll start with this quote. You guys can read it here. I won't necessarily read it to you. But despite the cliche of how difficult gulls are and how impossible they are for people, if you're a beginning birder, don't listen to all that stuff. They're not as difficult as people make them out to seem. I think if you spend enough time with a concerted effort to learn gull ID, it is a very doable task. Now, um, despite this craziness for us on the Great Lakes, gull watching is not easy because once this time of year rolls around, it's brutal conditions. It's tough birding. Like you have to bundle up, you have to have some patience and be ready to freeze. I do some gull watching in California, Florida, places where you can go out on the beach year round, pretty much in sandals, and it's just too easy. But for us, we're very fortunate because here on the Great Lakes, we have a good diversity of species. So we get the smaller tern-like gulls, the hooded gulls. We also get the large gulls around this time of year. By the way, this image is from the Gull Frolic on the Illinois-Wisconsin state line. This is an annual event we have in mid-February. This year, we'll be having it on February 16th, and it'll be the 23rd year that we've held this event. Basically, we just stand lakeside and we chum all day and bring in thousands of gulls, and we're treated to some pretty cool northern winter species. Variety among gulls. Somebody once said that about 90% of gulls can be identified just from looking at the head. And maybe that's true, but mostly for the adult birds. These are all adults. Some of the ones we should definitely know are like 2A. 2A is one of our most common gulls on Lake Michigan. This is a ring-billed. But we should also know 3A right underneath it. 3A is an American herring gull. 2B, do you guys recognize 2B here with the black bill, little pointy bill? That there is our Bonaparte's gull. We also have lesser blackback. Can anyone pick out lesser blackback? So lesser blackback always looks like it went overboard with lipstick. Just a big red goney spot on the bill. And this is a red goney spot. They tend to have a lot of streaking on the head in the fall and in the winter, but this streaking goes away in breeding plumage in the summer. Also of interest is this Kumleen's gull. This is an Iceland gull, has a short bill, and I know this is going to be really difficult for you guys to see, but the orbital ring, the skin around the eye, is pinkish. It's not red, it's not yellow, it's pinkish, and that's what we see in Thayer's and Kumlin's gulls. And it's actually quite noticeable if you have binoculars or a scope, or if you have a bird close enough. This orbital color is quite useful. I'm not going to go through the whole collage here, but I just want you to appreciate the variety here, the assortment of bill sizes and shapes and colors. You know, gulls are overall achromatic. They're made up mainly of blacks and whites and every shade of gray. Their plumages are not very colorful. They don't have the best voices, and maybe this is one of the reasons why they're not in vogue so much. But they do have fascinating life histories. Overall, gulls have what we call long life histories. Examples of organisms with long life histories are things like human beings and sea turtles. So what they do is they delay breeding for a number of years, and so their plumages are not adult-like in the first year of life. If you take a songbird that, say, hatched in June, 10 months later, that bird is an adult. It's on territory, it's breeding. Not so much with gulls. With gulls, we have 2-year species, 3-year species, and 4-year species. Much like bald eagles, they take a number of years to acquire adult plumage. And these subadult plumages simply signal that they're not sexually mature to reproduce yet. So they keep these browns and mottled plumages until they become adult-like and are ready to breed. They're also sexually monomorphic, meaning you can't tell the males and females apart because they have identical plumages. With gulls, the best we can do is look for larger sizes. So the males tend to be larger than females, kind of the opposite of what we find in raptors. And it's believed that color in birds is an ancestral state. And so it's believed that the ancestors of gulls and things like gannets and cormorants and herons used to have females that had color. But when these birds stopped breeding in protected areas and started breeding out in the open, they lost that color. So the color is an ancestral state. Lots of songbirds still have color because they still have females protecting the nests and breeding in trees. So they need those cryptic plumages. They need to be hidden. Whereas with gulls and other water birds, they're out in the open for the most part and don't need much concealing. I should identify these birds here since we have these here. These are our common species, guys. And if you're just beginning with gulls, these three should be learned really well. We have small, medium, and large. The leg color here and just the size. And if I gave you location, I think you'd agree. The small one is most likely a Bonaparte's with reddish legs. The medium one with yellow legs is most likely ring-billed. And the larger one with pink legs and a pale eye is most likely a herring gull. And that's what these are. These are our three benchmark species. Bonaparte's is a 2-year gull, meaning it acquires adult plumage in about 2 years. Ring-billed is a 3-year gull, and herring is a 4-year gull. And it just so happens that these 4 cycle species, herring, glaucus, Iceland, they tend to have longer life histories. So there are herring gulls that live for 30, 35 years. There are ring-bills that live for 20, 25 years. And then Bonapartes are believed to live for about 15, 20 years. So what's interesting is these birds put off breeding for a number of years, sort of as an investment in their reproduction cycle. With gulls, we generally think of them as 2 groups, the large white-headed gulls, like this great blackback here, and the small tern-like gulls, like this little gull. Little gull is our smallest gull in the world. It's about the size of a robin. Great blackback is our largest gull in the world. It has a wingspan that's just as wide as a bald eagle, if not wider. That's a great blackback there. Huge beast of a bird. This is an apex predator. They are high on the trophic level. They take rabbits, they take squirrels, they take ducks, they take other gulls. The only thing that really goes after great blackbacks are bald eagles. But back to this slide here, the taxonomy with gulls. We have 10 to 11 genera, depending on the taxonomy that you follow. These with asterisks are single species units. So Cragris, for example, is swallow-tailed gull, which is endemic to the Galapagos Islands. Zima is Sabin's gull. It's one species in that genus. By far, the largest genus is Laris, the large white-headed gulls, great blackbacks, lesser blackbacks, Iceland, ring-billed, glaucus, Western, California. Those are all terrestrial scavenging gulls. They're large. They take 3 to 4 years to mature. All these others are smaller 2-year, 3-year species. So there was a time when all of these gulls were placed in Laris. So this juvenile little gull in the foreground used to be in the same genus as great blackback. And then, in the mid 80s, they finally started to realize there's way too much diversity in this genus, and they started to split them up after they looked through their phylogenies. Um, so with the large white-headed gulls, we tell these birds apart primarily through eye color, through the shapes and sizes of their bills, but also importantly through their wingtip patterns. So, as you guys know, these black feathers sitting over the tail are the primaries. These are the longest flight feathers, the fingers, if you will, when the wing is open. This is not the tail. So, if we look at these two individuals here, sure, they're both kind of boring gray, yellow beaks with red spots, but they're two different species. The one in the back has a pale eye and it has an orange yellow orbital ring. That's a herring gull. Notice the primaries are jet black, whereas this Iceland gull in the foreground has a dark eye and it has a good amount of white here on the underside of the far wing. So I got to actually show this. Right here is the underside of the far wing. And it's very useful when you're looking at perched gulls in the winter. If you see a lot of white on the underside, that's very likely an Iceland gull, a Thayer's or a Coomlings. And also notice it's not jet black on the wingtip. It's more of a slaty, charcoal looking gray here, if you will. So these large four-cycle species, these white-headed gulls, these are your true seagulls, if you will. Here's what they look like as first cycles, as juveniles. And then, folks, 4 years later, they look like this. Let's say that again. So we got these first cycle birds and their juvenile plumages. They go through these amazing transformations over the course of 3.5 years, and then they eventually look like this as adults. So when we learn gull ID, it's best to begin with gulls that are adults because they are more distinctive. They have more uniform patterns, whereas these first cycle birds are just so variable and there's so much overlap. They take some practice. So my advice to experienced birders, go ahead and jump into the first cycles and second cycles. But to the novice, to the beginner, you want to make sure you know what an adult herring gull looks like, what an adult lesser blackback looks like. These two are definitely expected on Lake Michigan, especially lesser blackback now. It's become an annual visitor here in small numbers. Thayer's is a winter species. They start getting here right about now. There's reports of Thayer's already being seen throughout the Great Lakes. California gull's a treat, right? We don't really expect them every year, although they do occur every year on the Great Lakes. They have darker gray backs, dark eyes, and yellowish legs. The legs almost always have this greenish cast to them. They're not that mustard yellow of ring-billed gull. But also notice California gulls have this red goney spot, and ring-billed gulls never show red on the bill. That's one of our only Laris species that never shows red on the bill. Among these large four-cycle gulls, we have the blackbacks and we have the white wingers. So these are loose terms that field ornithologists have used for years. The blackbacks are things like great blackback, lesser blackback, and the white wingers are things like this glaucous. Iceland is considered a white winger, and so is glaucous winged. To quantify these shades of gray, because there's so many of them, we use something called a Kodak grayscale, and this is in my upcoming guide. This scale has been used by ornithologists for a number of decades. The only species that scores a 0 is ivory gull, and then great blackback is something like a 15, okay? We don't really expect things to have Kodak grayscale values of 18 and 19. Some of the European lesser blackbacks in the old world have backs this dark, some of the kelp gulls, but for us, we don't really expect anything beyond a 15. So a good gull book will tell you when you read a chapter about a species, it has Kodak grayscale from 6 to 8, or it has Kodak grayscale from 3 to 5. We get these ranges that tell you about the variability. With the large gulls, hybridization is quite prevalent, especially the farther north you go. This is a real thing. Gulls, probably more than any other group of birds outside of like waterfowl, have a tendency to hybridize. And it doesn't really matter what species. You have about 12 species in the north, the closer you get to the Arctic Circle. Wherever they come into contact, they freely hybridize. So we have things like American herring gull and glaucous gull that hybridize. And that's what we're seeing here. And when they hybridize their hybrids, the offspring are called Nelson's gulls. So this is a hybrid that we expect almost every year on the Great Lakes. It's intermediate between the black wingtips of American herring and the white wingtips of glaucous gull. It has these slaty colored wingtips, and the size tends to be intermediate. They're beautiful birds. It was once thought that Nelson's is a species, but we now know it's just a hybrid. A common place where they hybridize is the Mackenzie Delta in northern Alaska and the Northwest Territories. But the problem with these large gulls, guys, is there's no good species concept that we can apply to them. The biological species concept says if two populations interbreed and have fertile offspring, then it should be considered one species. If you take things like western gull and glaucous wing gull, the Pacific Northwest, there are hybrid swarms where these things have been hybridizing for millennia, and the hybrids outnumber the parents in those areas, in places like Oregon and British Columbia and Washington. But they're not considered one species because the parent species have distinct DNA. Western gull and glaucous wing gull are from different clades. They're not closely related, yet they interbreed, and the hybrids are fertile, and it's very perplexing. Glaucous and American herring, these two, they have very, very similar DNA, yet they look different outwardly. In fact, the glaucous gulls in North America appear to be more genetically related to American herring gulls in North America than glaucous gulls are related to glaucous gulls in Europe. So you have glaucous gulls in Europe, glaucous gulls in North America. Their DNA does not seem to be as closely related as American herring in the United States and glaucous gulls in North America. It's quite a challenge to try to put a good species concept on these things genetically and interbreeding wise. So that's why when we talk about the small gulls, they seem to be a relief for most people. These are a breath of fresh air. The small gulls are nimble. They have these raspy voices. They don't scavenge as much. They tend to eat a lot more over the sea and over open waters. Our most common small gull is Bonapartes, and that's what we're seeing in this slide here. Bonapartes should be learned well. If you want to know what these others look like, you should really be comparing them to Bonapartes. Bonapartes has this dark trailing edge all along the wing in its first cycle, and that's what we're seeing here. This is not an adult. It has a black tail band. It has this carpal bar across the upper wing. Come April, May, June, these are very common in places like Sheboygan and Manitowoc and other places on the lakefront. After them, I would say little gull is probably the next most expected. Wisconsin tends to be one of the best places on the Great Lakes to see little gull. And if you're interested in seeing them, you'd probably want to visit Sheboygan and Manitowoc in May. Sabins is a beast. This one is a treat. Usually we don't see sabins unless, you get lucky on the lake sometime in September. Ivory Ross is quite rare. Black-legged kittiwake we've already discussed. We might see a few of those every year. So among these birds are some of the most coveted bird species in the world. As adults, they really don't get any better than this. This is a Ross's gull with the black necklace. This is an ivory gull with the yellow bill tip. Little gull doesn't have any eye arcs. It's just an all black head, red legs. But also notice on the underwing here, the black, that's a diagnostic field mark on little gull. And this here, one of my favorite is Sabins or Sabines or Sabines. We could never agree on how to pronounce this one, but it's Sabines for me. They have this nice, neat necklace and a yellow tip on the bill. It's believed Sabines is sister species to ivory gull, which is interesting because they share that yellow bill tip. But also, Sabines has a black necklace. I don't know if you guys can see that. It has a black necklace, just like Ross's gull. So there's something neat going on there. Maybe some common ancestry. Who knows? So Sabines is our longest migrating gull in the world. They breed in the Arctic, and then they take on this oceanic migration. Some of them go down the Pacific, as you see on these red maps here, and then some of them go down the Atlantic and find their way to the Benguela Current off of South Africa. This map that you're seeing here is from a recent study, maybe about 7, 8 years ago. What they found was when they fit two adults with geo-trackers on the breeding grounds, a mated pair, they found that the male went down the Pacific Ocean and the female went down the Atlantic Ocean. They wintered off of different oceans. They regrouped the next breeding season and bred right where they were banded the previous spring. This was the first known documentation of divergent migratory pathways where two birds have wintered off of different oceans and then regrouped and reunited to breed again. That was a fascinating point in ornithological history. But we now know there's shorebirds that do this. There are geese that do this sort of thing, and even like shearwaters. So it's pretty common knowledge now that birds can be wintering in different oceans, but breeding in the same colonies. Back to ID. So the small 2-year gulls, a lot of them have these M patterns over the back, these carpal bars. We've already said Bonaparte's has a black trailing edge all across the trailing edge here. This is the only species that shows this, the only regularly expected small gull in North America that shows this. This one, C with the big hind collar, this thick shawl, that's black-legged kittiwake, and it never shows any black on the trailing edge. This one's a bit smaller, and it has a very prominent carpal bar, very dark upper wing pattern. And so we have little gull, Bonaparte's, and kittiwake. And when you have them perched, folks, usually they don't present many ID problems. Our field guides do a good job describing them. It's when we have them in flight, zipping by somewhere on a lake, somewhere on a river. If you can capture the upper wing and just try to get an imprint of what you saw on the upper wing, did it have an all dark trailing edge? Did it have a prominent hind collar on the neck? Was the tail band thin or was the tail band kind of rectangular? So these are the sort of things we want to discuss with the small 2-cycle species. This was taken in Manitowoc. We have a Bonaparte's and a little gull. Can you tell which one's the Bonaparte's and which one is the little gull? Definitely. The dark trailing edge is bony and the thick carpal bar is little gull. These are both first cycles. The little gull just happened to take on an all black hood in its first alternate plumage, which is kind of unique. Another bird for us here, again from the underwing. I'm noticing that all dark trailing edge that should be a Bonaparte's, has a nice little ear spot. This one here has a thick hind collar. I'm seeing that, but it doesn't have black legs. I could see it has white on the trailing edge, so I'm going to rule out Bonaparte's. What do you think, folks? Is this a little gull or is this a kittiwake? So we want to be careful with leg color because it turns out about 1 out of 20 black-legged kittiwakes don't have black legs as first cycles. So this brownish orange leg color that you see is actually pretty expected in some first cycle, some juvenile black-legged kittiwakes. So this is a kittiwake, and the hind collar there is mostly what I'm using to identify this bird. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and use some time to talk about terminology that you guys might see in a field guide, or if you're following a discussion online, you've probably heard the word mirrors. Not enough resources do a good job describing these words, so I'm going to take some time to talk to you about mirrors. Mirrors are these white spots that you see on the outer flight feathers. And when you have the bird perched like this adult ring-billed, these are not the mirrors, these white spots that we're seeing. Those are the very, very tips of the feathers. These tips are what you're seeing when the bird is perched. These are called apicals, okay? The mirrors are concealed when the bird is perched like this. So once you get that open wing, you can see the mirrors. These are primary feathers, guys. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is P9, and this is P10. And with gulls and most other birds, there's 10 primaries on each wing, 10 on the left wing, 10 on the right wing. And these are the longest flight feathers that this bird has. The mirrors are quite important when we look at gull identification. This top bird is a laughing gull. It doesn't show any mirrors. This middle bird is a herring gull. It shows one mirror. And the herring gulls that we see on the Great Lakes, our population, they generally show just one mirror as an adult. This bird down here is a Thayer's gull. Thayer's tends to show more gray on these primaries, less black on the wingtip. And these mirrors usually average pretty large on Thayer's. This one's actually a Thayer's that has quite a bit of black. But in comparison to this Great Lakes herring gull, I could see the difference there. Extensive black, reduced black. So the hooded gulls, like Laughing Gull and Franklin's gull, can easily be told apart because Laughing Gull never shows mirrors. But adult Franklins typically show a mirror or two. But in addition to that, you'll notice that Franklin's has a medial band, and the medial band is this white partition here on the primaries. Do you guys see this buffer here? I don't know if you can see my laser. But with Franklin's, what we have is it goes from gray, and then it has white, and then the black wingtip. Whereas in Laughing Gull, it's just all black and straight gray, no white medial band. These two have radically different lifestyles. Laughing Gull is mostly coastal. You'll find them from, say, New York down through the Gulf of Mexico to Central America. Whereas Franklin's gull tends to stay in the interior. This is a pothole prairie breeder, sometimes known as the prairie dove. They're not crazy about handouts. They're not begging on the beaches like Laughing Gull. And they have a long migration. With respect to migration and gulls, Franklin's has the second longest migration of all gulls. These birds end up in places like Peru and Chile in the northern winter, and then they breed in places like the Dakotas and up through Alberta and Saskatchewan. So radically different lifestyles. Franklin's is known to follow the plow. They time their migration around this time of year, so that when farmers are out there plowing, they're out there catching bugs, grasshoppers, eating mice, whereas Laughing Gull is typically expected on the shoreline. We do see both of these species on Lake Michigan. May tends to be the best month to see them. We get some overshooters, some Laughing Gulls coming up the Mississippi Flyway, coming over the East Coast, and then Franklin's gulls regularly make it to Lake Michigan. October tends to be the best month to see them, by the way. So when they're perched, what you'll notice is Franklin's gull almost always has a slightly gentler bill. It has these thicker eye crescents. They really pop, bold white eye crescents. And month for month, Franklin's almost always shows this half hood appearance. It's this nice demarcated hood, whereas Laughing Gull will take a patchy head pattern. It'll have quite a bit of white on the head. Franklin's almost always shows a pretty nice half hood. This is a Franklin's gull, but it's not quite adult. And we know it's not an adult because, well, it doesn't show really prominent medial band, but also you see these black streaks right here on the primary coverts. These black streaks indicate this bird is not a definitive adult. It's probably a 1 year old, if I had to guess. This is a bird that I photographed in Indiana in October. And I just like to show it with respect to size and color. It's darker than ring-billed gull and definitely smaller than ring-billed gull. But notice, folks, notice the eye arcs are very prominent. The half-hooded appearance, it has this solid black on the back of the hood. This is a Franklin's gull. Interesting thing about Franklin's, it's our only gull in the world that shows gray on the upper tail. Are you noticing that gray? So it has it. It's pretty obvious. And ring-billed and all these other species never show that gray. In fact, I can go back a slide or two, and you'll notice this adult Franklin's has noticeable gray on the tail. Laughing gulls and the others never do. So one of the suggested names for Franklin's gull, as we're going to see these name changes, all these English names of birds named after people, that's going to be phased out in the next few years. And one of the suggested names for Franklin's is gray-tailed gull. As boring as that sounds, it's quite descriptive. It's the only gull with a gray tail or gray on the tail. But things like Sabins and Rosses and Bonapartes, those are the others that might see name changes in the next 5 to 10 years. Just really quick before we move on to some of the bigger things, these are laughing gulls, except for one ring-billed and one Franklin's. This is the ring-billed, pink bill base, gray on the back, kind of mottled breast. But these others are all laughing gulls and one first-year Franklin's. Can you pick out the first-year Franklin's? Look at the eye crescents. It should have more of a half hood, more of a solid half hood. This is the Franklin's. Notice the bill size variation in the laughing gulls. This laughing gull, first year laughing gull, shows all this brown on the wing, has quite a big bill. But this other laughing gull might be a female type, has a gentler bill, about the same size as the Franklin's. So we want to be careful when we use size and bill shape with gulls in particular, because as I mentioned earlier, males tend to be about 20 to 30% larger than females. And that's even more true when we look at things like ring-billed gull and herring gull. The larger gulls, that size difference is exaggerated. In flight, really fast, guys, can you pick out the Franklin's and the laughing gull? One of these is Franklin's, one of these is laughing. I think, again, if you just go off the head pattern, you would have it. But then another difference we talk about with laughing and Franklin's in their first year is the tail pattern. Laughing gull generally has an all dark tail all the way to the tail base. Franklin's gull has a thinner tail band, and then the black usually doesn't reach the outer tail feathers. It remains black, but not to the outer tail feathers in Franklin's. Again, these are all things you can look up on your eBird photos and your field guides, and then you can go back and rewind this video when you have a chance. I'm sure you've heard the word windows. What are windows, folks? Windows, gulls, some have windows, some don't have windows. So the individual on the left does not show a window, but the bird on the right does have a window. What is a window? So windows are the inner primaries being slightly paler than the outer primaries. Let me trace these things if you don't mind. Let me trace this. So these are the inner primaries, and they're pale. And this lesser black back on the left doesn't have a window. No window. And this one does have a window. Basically, just like in some raptors, sometimes this is used. You're looking for a contrasting pale region, and that's known as the window. So herring gulls, and that's what this bird on the right is, it's a herring gull. Herring gulls are expected to show windows as first-year birds. Lesser blackbacks, California gulls, these are things that don't show windows. We're expecting to see all dark inner primaries. But also, if you would, please compare the tail pattern, because tail patterns are very important in these first-year laris gulls. In lesser blackback gull, we generally expect a good amount of white on the tail base and a fairly white ground color to the tail coverts, whereas American herring gull, it generally shows less contrast and a darker tail. Okay, that's helpful, especially now with the increase of lesser blackback gulls on Lake Michigan. It's nice to know what these younger lesser blackbacks look like. They tend to have more solid, greater coverts. They tend to show wider heads, and they generally keep a blacker bill longer into the season. So if you're out looking at herring gulls and lesser blackback gulls in May, June next year, you're going to notice the lesser blackbacks tend to keep blacker bills and wider heads. Okay, that in addition to what you're seeing on the open tail and open wing. So back to the large white-headed gulls. I think we'll spend the rest of the time here talking about that. And if somebody wants to interject here, just let me know how I'm doing on time and how much time I got. I'd be appreciative. I'm gonna guess since I'm not hearing anything, we have everybody has fallen asleep. What do we got here? About 10 minutes, 3 hours.
There we go. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, you got time. We're here. We've got a attentive audience.
All right.
So fill us in.
Thank you, Jeff. So, guys, when we talk about large white-headed gulls, and these are everybody's favorite, right? If you've been putting off large white-headed gull identification, herrings, Icelands, Glaucous, blackbacks, the first rule that you want to abide by is you must allow for variation in size and color, and then also allow for variation. And then don't forget also to allow for variation. I think I've made my point here. Um, Unfortunately, the large gulls don't always play by the rules. If you look in things like Sibley, your Kaufman guide, your Peterson, they only have limited space for gulls, and they have to show you what they think an average first year, average second year bird looks like. But we know that there's so much variation in those earlier plumages. You need a good gull book or a good gull resource to show you that variation if you're going to seriously take on gull identification. Size variation, as I mentioned earlier, males are 20 to 30% larger than females. That's one of the ways we tell them apart. But even so, guys, if you go out in the winter and you're looking at these things, you really can't be sure if you're looking at a big female or a small male. Oftentimes when we use male, female, we say type, right? We qualify our statement with the one on the right is a male type. The one on the female is a female type. So these are ring-billed gulls courting in April. And if you're looking at them in April, May, it doesn't take very long. If they're courting or near nests, it doesn't take very long to realize which one's male and which one's female. Similarly, with these great blackback gulls, these were birds on Appledore Island. I was out there banding chicks with some biologists, and these birds just kind of sat over us and watched us as we were banding their chicks on this little island. Can you tell just from the bill girth and the head size which one is male and which one's female, if you had to guess? So the one in the front is certainly the male, and the one in the back there with the gentler, smaller head, thinner bills, female. So these are things that we regularly see with gulls. Thick bill, blockier head on the males, and then the females just tend to look a little bit gentler. The head shape is useful. You know, I mentioned heads on males tend to be blockier and square, but also this is a function of behavior, guys. I'm sure if you've watched birds long enough, you see the head size and the head shape change. If they fluff out their feathers, if they're, alarmed or agitated, they might look a different way. So that's also real. And with that, amazingly, the bill shape and the bill size sometimes has this illusion that it looks longer or shorter. So if the feathers around the bill base are fluffed out, that bill might seem shorter. But if the feathers around the bill base are matted down and compressed, that bill might look stronger and longer. So these are things to just keep in mind when you're trying to explore. Does this thing have a big bill, small bill? Does this thing have a blocky head, a rounded head? So, by the way, these are both the same bird. This is a third year American herring gull, has pinkish legs, has a pale eye. And overall, third year herring gulls look closer to adults than anything else, but you'll notice these blemishes, the brown on the tertials, the brown wash on the wing coverts here. There's just quite a bit of black on the bill tip here, so there's no way this is an adult. The best way to age this bird is a third year or third cycle herring gull. These two are also herring gulls. This one's an adult here, probably a female type. And this one's a second year herring gull. So we were not going to call this one a third year. If you want to compare this second year just as a aging exercise, why isn't this a third cycle? Well, the bill base is pretty pink, and the primaries here are not showing those prominent white apicals. We go back to this third cycle, you see these white spots on the tips, and on the far wing, it shows this mirror. You could see that mirror on the underside of the far wing. It's even here, kind of when the feather shifts, you can see that. And there's just a good amount of gray on the back. So this one, again, being closer to an adult, we're going to call it third cycle. And this one here, we're going to call second cycle. You might ask, so why isn't this a first year bird? That's a good question. First year herring gulls don't have pale eyes, right? First year herring gulls have darkish eyes. They're never really this pale. And then they also don't show this solid adult-like gray. This is a characteristic of a second year bird. All right. But the point, I think, of this slide was to show the size difference. Notice how big that male or male type looks on the left, and then the adult looks fairly small in comparison. Size variation. Okay, we got a jumbo pale bird in the back, pretty pale. This looks like a white winger. And if I told you it was on Lake Superior, your choices are probably Glaucous gull or Iceland gull. Now, based on the size being this big compared to the herring, it's got to be Glaucous gull. But also, guys, the bill pattern is very important. Glaucous gull has this demarcated black tip with a pink base. Almost all these first year Glaucous gulls that we see in the winter have this bill pattern as first year birds. Here's another Glaucous gull, but this time it looks to be just about the same size as the herring gull. So size variation, this may be a male type, and this one here may be a female type. I can easily see someone mistaking this for an Iceland gull, but let's look at the bill pattern. Iceland gulls here on Lake Michigan, they're not going to show this bill pattern as first year birds. And we know this is a first year bird, has these pointy primaries, this checkered, very frosted looking appearance, dark eye. A nice comparison here is a Glaucous gull and an Iceland gull, both first cycles or juveniles. You can see here the size difference, the bill pattern. Here's the Glaucous gull, bigger bird, pink bill base, and then the Iceland gull looks a little more diminutive and with a petite black bill. Okay. So the subspecies of Iceland gull that we get two. We get Thayers, which is now an Iceland gull, and we get Kumlines. Kumlines. Kumlien apostrophe S. Kumline, as a matter of fact, he and his father were both ornithologists from Wisconsin. That's where they settled, and I think that's where they both passed. So you guys have that going for you. Kumlin's gull is one of the most ambiguous gulls in the ABA area. We're not sure if this thing is a transient species. We don't know if it's a hybrid. We don't know if it's just a pale form of Thayer's or a dark form of the nominate Iceland gull. It is truly a mystery that awaits solution. And we're fortunate here on the Western Great Lakes to see them along with Thayer's gulls every winter. And they are definitely the most entertaining part of winter gull watching, pretty much all throughout the Great Lakes, to see these Iceland gulls and the variety of plumages that they have. Back to adults. Like I said, if you're just beginning with gull ID, adults are usually the best ones to start with because they're so distinctive, they're quite uniform. In this slide, guys, we have a lesser blackback. It's the only blackback in this slide. Notice it's about the size of a herring gull. Some tend to be a little bit smaller. Some are sometimes a little bit bigger, but they're generally about herring size. We don't expect them to be bigger than herring, unless you have an extreme male or something. The other key species in this slide is the white-winger, glaucous gull. Glaucous gulls generally are going to be bigger than our American herring gulls. They're also paler gray. This is a very pale gray. And I don't know if you guys see what I see here, but this American herring is pretty pale, but glaucous is even paler. So sometimes if you're scanning a flock, you got gulls sitting on the ice, half a mile away, and the wingtip might be obscured and covered by the other birds standing around it. If you see a paler gray back, that's reason to stop and kind of take a closer look and maybe wait until you can see the wingtip, and perhaps you have yourself a glaucous or a glaucous hybrid of some sort. Lesser blackback on the left, American herring on the right. Notice lesser blackback has yellow legs. We're not going to confuse that with great blackback, which would be larger with pink legs. Lesser blackback is sort of an enigma in North America. They've only been here for like the last 80 years. The first record was in New Jersey, I think, in the 1930s. And since then, they've just undergone this transatlantic expansion. They've invaded the North American continent. We can see thousands of them now along the Atlantic coast down to Florida and Texas in the winter. The amazing thing is we've never had a record of a breeding pair of pure lesser blackbacks in the United States or Canada. So we still don't know if they actually breed in the United States or Canada. The closest known colonies are in Greenland, and birds that have been tagged with GPS trackers have been seen like in late March through May migrating straight to Greenland. And so it's hard to believe that with the hundreds that we see here, that none of them are breeding somewhere in the US or maybe northern Canada somewhere, but that's still a mystery for us. And it's very exciting because my feeling is any day now we're going to find some lesser blackbacks breeding somewhere, but not yet. A comparison here of herring gull and an Iceland gull. I'm sure if you guys have been listening, you know the bigger one with the black wingtips in the back here is a herring gull, pink legs, pale eye. But this guy in the front, I'm reluctant to call it anything other than an Iceland gull. This is one of those confusing Iceland gulls that we have here on the Great Lakes. Some people out west in places like California, British Columbia, Washington might call this a Thayer's. And then if you go to the Atlantic, places like Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, they might call this a Kumlins, the intergrade, the intermediate population. So what do we call it here on the Great Lakes? Well, the first thing I notice is that the gray back looks slightly paler than the herring gull. So that's an indication that this is coomlins, because coomlins tends to be slightly paler than American herring. So that's troubling. If I didn't have this herring gull next to it, I wouldn't be sure entirely. The dark eye, folks, let's just put this to rest. If you're looking at Iceland gulls this winter, eye color is not helpful. Some thayers are dark-eyed, some thayers are light-eyed. Some coomlins are dark-eyed, some coomlins are light-eyed. So we know now definitively that eye color is variable. It's not a reliable field mark for either subspecies, okay? Do note the wingtips, though. That's a lot of white. If I'm scanning a flock of gulls and I can't make out eye color or anything else, I will take note of these wingtips. That's a lot of white. And then even here, these black bands seem to be fading. We're not going to see that in American herring gull. It's going to be solid black swaths. Here, this charcoal-looking, slate-colored black is a telltale sign that we have an Iceland gull. All right. It is 7:40. I think I've been rambling for an hour now. I can go on if you'd like me to. I can pause for questions. But the great thing again about this is my understanding is you guys are recording this. So folks who have interest in going back and re-listening to this, you can always do that. But I'll just wait on your cue here if you'd like me to.
Do we have any quick questions?
Yeah, if there's something here, like you're noticing the bill pattern, the bill size, anything you need to get off, or we can come back to this slide, maybe just keep note of that number there.
Okay. Go ahead. Oh,
Yeah, Soren.
somebody raised their hand. Okay. Um, chat. Where did it go? Okay. So Soren is going to ask, type in a question here quick.
Yeah. Mic isn't working. Sorry, I will type. Go for it. Yeah. Give me a chance to breathe here.
So, um,
I had a really quick question, if you don't mind, while Soren's typing.
Please.
When you were talking about male versus female, and forgive me, but I think sometimes I think about reverse sexual dimorphism with birds.
Yeah.
Sorry, so for gulls, are males always typically larger than females then?
Yes, that's the general rule, and it's more exaggerated in the laris species. So you'll notice it's very obvious with herring gulls, ring-billed gulls, the blackback gulls. Once you get down to things like Bonapartes and little gull, the size difference is not as obvious. But if you had a bird in hand, the measurements do indicate males always average larger than females with gulls.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
okay. We have,
Yeah. Jeff, I see the question there.
okay.
So it's very, very rare to have a herring gull with two dark eyes. It's not something you need to be concerned with. What happens is with some adult herring gulls, you have about 2 to 5% of them where one eye is dark and one eye is pale. Just to mess with our heads, about 2 to 5% of herring gulls have one dark eye and one pale eye. And there's a number of reasons for this. I outline those reasons in my book. One of the most common reasons is just a rare allele. You have some genetic mutation where one eye is dark, one eye is pale. Other reasons for this is it could be some disease. It could be a defective eye. Sometimes when gulls are fighting, especially younger birds, they poke each other in the eye and they lose an eye. And so the eye is just defective and they can't see through the dark eye anymore. But to your question, I would be very, very curious if you had a herring gull with two dark eyes. All right, there's usually a story behind that. a herring gull with two dark eyes, you should be looking into things like, how do I know it's not a Thayer's? How do I know it's not a Vega gull? Let me look at the leg color. My shirt has pink legs, that sort of thing. So I would investigate if you thought you had a herring gull with two dark eyes. It's not expected.
Okay, Amir, about like 10 more minutes, 15
You
minutes.
got it. 10 more minutes it is. You're very welcome, Soren. So now, I did mention that recently Thayer's gull was lumped with the Iceland gulls. The previous taxonomy, and everybody lost a bird because of this. We lost a bird from our state list. You guys lost a bird from your state list. But for decades, ornithologists have been perplexed by Thayer's gull. Is it a good species? It was once thought to be a subspecies of herring gull. Many ornithologists that have been to the Arctic had suspicions that it's a dark form of Iceland gull. And in the late 1950s, 1960s, a biologist by the name of Neil Smith went up to the Arctic. He falsified some findings. And based on his dissertation, the American Ornithological Society decided, okay, so we think we have a good species here. And they gave Thayer's species status in the early 70s. Fast forward, 50 years later, there's still all this confusion about where do we position Kumlin's gull? What is happening? So if you look at the range maps here, Thayer's is a high Arctic breeder. Kumlin's breeds more on Baffin Island, Southampton Island, lower Arctic region. And then the nominate subspecies, Glaucous, the palest one with all white wingtips, breeds in Greenland and winters primarily off of Greenland and the Atlantic. And some of them, about 10% of the population, breeds or winters in Iceland. So about 5 years ago, Thayer's was again lumped with Iceland gulls. And we here on the Great Lakes, as I mentioned, expect these two subspecies, Kumlii and Thayeri. Eye color is variable. Kumlin's averages paler wingtips. Thayer's averages darker wingtips. Overall, guys, Thayer's is a Pacific Coast wintering bird. If you want to see hundreds and hundreds of them, you go to places like Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, and that's where you'll see them in the winter. But we have a good pocket of them here on the Western Great Lakes, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, mixed in with these Kumlin's gulls. Okay, so that's the taxonomy behind this. That's where we're at with this. It might be in our lifetime where they figure out what's happening in the Arctic, how much interbreeding is going on. Do we have 3 good species? Do we have 2 species? So the wrench in all this is Kumlin's gull. Where do we position this thing? Is it a subspecies of Thayer's? Is it a subspecies of Iceland? Or is it a hybrid? Is it an incipient species? Nobody really knows, including myself. All right, so I'm going to close there, guys. If you are not a part of the North American Gulls group on Facebook, consider joining. That's a Facebook group that I administer. It's going on, I believe, 13, 14 years now. We've been at it. We got like 15,000 members. Lots of good gull ID, gull discussion there. As Jeff mentioned, my website is anythinglaris.com. And please, if you're looking for a new gull resource, the Gull Guide will be out in less than 2 weeks. I think it's the only gull book you will ever need. So thank you guys. It's been an honor talking to you guys. I hope we bump into some of you in the field, perhaps on Lake Michigan or somewhere neat around the landfill. Thank you.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions from our audience? Yes, Matt.
Where do the herring and ring-billed gulls that we see on Lake Michigan in the summer, where do they breed?
Okay, so the question was, where do the herring and ring-billed gulls that we see here breed?
Yeah, they are scattered all throughout the lakefront. Most of the herrings you guys see are rooftop breeders. A lot of them breed on rooftops from Milwaukee to Sheboygan to Manitowoc, all the way up to Door County. Um, the birds you see might be on little small lakes somewhere where there's no access for predators. But generally speaking, most of the Great Lakes herring gulls are on very small islands or they're on rooftops.
So I'll add a local note to that. The Fleet Farm, the roof of Fleet Farm in Beaver Dam. The herring gulls have nested there the last 4, 5, 6 years, whatever, since the last confirmed the last breeding bird atlas. So
Yeah, a little interesting tidbit here. We had a colony of 60,000 ring-billed gulls breeding on a little lake here in southeast Chicago. City of Chicago went in and they oiled all their eggs. I don't know if you guys are familiar with oiling. They destroyed the entire colony within a couple years, and those birds all just dispersed and they started nesting on rooftops right in the city. So they didn't get rid of the gulls, they just kind of displaced them, and the gulls resorted to rooftops.
awesome. Any other
This is a quick plug that, two items here. First is a quick plug that gulls are showing up here right in front of the building at 3 o'clock. There's like a 200, and there has been a report of a younger, lesser black-back gull in the area. But if you're a local bird, look those, scan those closer, and the question, then I heard of a Great Lakes gull. I believe it's a hybrid. Could you explain what a Great Lakes gull is?
Okay, so we had a observation that Matt, one of our board members here, says we've been getting some good viewing right from our education center here. They're around. They had a report of a lesser blackback juvenile gull the past week or so, and so his question was, he's heard of a Great Lakes gull. Is that a fill us in on that?
Yeah, so Great Lakes gull refers to a hybrid between herring gull and great blackback gull. And they tend to be most common on the Great Lakes, and that's why we gave them that name. It's a very, very recently discovered hybrid. I'm sure they've been hybridizing much longer than we know, but for whatever reason, they really like Lake Michigan and Lake Erie, all the way to, say, Niagara Falls. Like I said, it's mainly a Great Lakes phenomenon. They're not really found on the Atlantic, but we could expect about 10 of them a year are reported throughout the Great Lakes. And we don't really know what the first and second cycle birds look like. They're still very confusing. We're not sure how to identify them. We take guesses at it, but the adults are pretty distinctive. You are very likely to know when you see one that it's too pale for a great blackback gull and it's too dark for a herring gull. So they're intermediate in their upper parts. They tend to be closer to great blackback in darkness. And the main problem with this is they do a good job of mimicking slatyback gulls. And that's the confusion for us on the Great Lakes. And it happens every winter, especially in Wisconsin. Somebody will be on the Milwaukee lakefront or something, and they'll say, I have a slatyback gull. And then the photos appear, and it's a Great Lakes gull. So the best way to tell them apart from slatyback gulls is they tend to have less head streaking. And the key is to look at the open wing. When you see the open wing, the tips of the inner primaries. If you guys remember a few slides back when I talked about windows, the inner primaries, on the adult, Great Lakes gulls, the inner primaries will have thin white tips. And on slaty-back gull, they have very broad white tips. So that's the distinguishing feature. When you look at slaty-back gull, they have thick white tips on the trailing edge. And then those Great Lakes hybrids, they have thin white tips on the trailing edge. But yeah, it's a hybrid. It's increasing. It should be on our radar. If you're looking at gulls in the winter, it's more likely that you'll see a Great Lakes gull than a slaty-back gull.
That does clear up some things then.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Isaac.
So where and when can we get this book?
Yeah, so it's on pre-order right now. I think the cheapest place to find it right now is Amazon, but it's also on the Princeton University Press website. People are going to start getting them in the mailbox. I'm hearing the earliest people are going to get it is October 29th, October 30th. But this was 5.5 years of writing, folks. And from the reviews that I've gotten so far from people who know about this group of birds, it's going to stand the test of time, I hope. It has so many photos, over 1,800 photos. And there's a 60-page introduction that lays out all the introductory and preliminary knowledge that one needs to really start approaching gull ID in the soundest manner. Thank you, Margaret.
I did notice just by your photographs there, a very good camera and a 600 millimeter lens would probably come in pretty handy.
Yeah, I have to say, guys, one of the frustrating things with gulls, especially for us, we live in cold climates here, and if you're looking at distant gulls, it's quite frustrating. And so some places I can suggest is like the Johnson Creek landfill. If you can get to that Coles parking lot, if you can get to McKinley Marina on the lakefront, if you can get to Sheboygan on the river there, you want your gulls as close as possible. And I don't promote chumming, but I understand well that gulls have made humans part of their experience, and they are around us because they expect handouts, because they expect us to throw away food, because they expect something in return. And so if you ever think you have a really interesting gull and you need to get it closer, it's not very hard, especially when it's very cold outside, to get gulls closer. And if you're worried about, well, we shouldn't be feeding wildlife and what have you, we feed wildlife in all sorts of ways. Everybody with a backyard bird feeder feeds wildlife. These northern gulls that come down here in the winter, they're here primarily for our landfills. They're not feeding on the abundance of fish on Lake Michigan. They're not feeding on the plankton on Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is essentially a clean bathtub for them, where they spend a lot of time preening and bathing and roosting. Most of the feeding that these herring gulls, Iceland gulls, Glaucous gulls, blackback gulls are doing are in the landfills day in, day out. And so if you start to see more gull traffic at the end of the day somewhere, it's because they're leaving the landfills when they stop churning trash. They know it's time to go home, time to go roost somewhere. And you'll see them flying en masse over a lake, over your neighborhood, over your job site. But those gulls, rest assured, are feeding on those potatoes that you threw away, those chicken bones that you threw away. I've seen gulls feeding on full diapers. Sorry, Paul. Yeah, I've seen gulls, Jeff, feeding on stuff you wouldn't imagine, in paint buckets. And it's no surprise that we have gulls that have more aberrations than most other bird groups. They have such diverse diets. And there's this rule in biology that the more variable a species diet, the more likely it is to have defects and aberrations. And I can't think of another group of birds that has as much aberrations as gulls. I mean, they do the weirdest things. Somebody asked about herring gull eye color, a dark eye and a pale eye. That's a pretty uncommon thing, but 2 to 5% of herring gulls show that. And it's no surprise to me that these are birds that feed on our trash. They're such generalists.
Uh, how far will a gull travel to feed?
Yeah, so it's thought on average, average day they travel round trip about 45 miles.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that does kind of confirm that we get some of Johnson's Creek gulls in the Mayville landfill, and halfway in between, you'd have all of a sudden, a field will have thousands of gulls, and then the next day there's nothing. So it's, where do they go? So
Yeah. About 10 years ago, I found a slaty-back gull like 15 miles inland at a landfill away from Lake Michigan. And then the next day, we had that bird at our golf frolic, 15 miles away. So that bird roosted on the lake, and then in the morning flew out to the landfill 15 miles and then flew back 15 miles. So that's a half hour, 30-minute, 30-mile trip there, 15 miles and 15 miles. Yeah, not uncommon at all, Jeff, to have these guys go 30 to 40 miles easy, back and forth. And that's just to get from A to B. They do a lot of moving around during the day as well as they're looking for food. Because what they'll do is, and we have data now that shows they'll go to a landfill. And if they're not finding what they need, they go to another landfill. They landfill hop. They go from landfill to landfill if those landfills are close enough. And that's why some of the best skull watching is where you have 2 or 3 close by landfills, because they'll use like a roosting spot as their central location, and then they'll just go from landfill to landfill. And that also makes it challenging to chase like a rare gull. When somebody sees it at one landfill, the next day it might be somewhere else.
that yeah, makes perfect sense, because we're about 40 miles inland from Lake Michigan. So we would be well within their range of, a day hike or for a food source. So
Sure.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions here from the audience? Okay, if not, again, Amir, that was very, very informative. You kind of put it in simplistic fashion. I've got a note of a half a dozen different things here from now on I'll be able to look at. Kind of confirmed, I got my 3 gulls down, and then some of the other ones that we may see. So my goal is to find a little gull at some point. So
Yeah.
that would be a lifer for me. So
Go to Sheboygan in May and make sure there's lots of Bonapartes being reported. Once the Bonapartes are reported, say 100, 200 of them, there's a little gull in that flock. You just got to go find it. But that's usually the key. April, May, June, when the Bonaparte numbers peak, there's got to be a little gull there.
okay.
If I could just plug the Gull Frolic, it is a neat event that's on Lake Michigan. I know we got every year a couple Wisconsin birders, Indiana birders, Michigan birders come up to it, but it's going to be in mid-February. If you look on the Illinois Ornithological Society website, registration opens in like 2 weeks. The neat thing about this site is we are literally birding on the Illinois-Wisconsin line. So we're watching gulls fly in from Wisconsin, fly out to Illinois. It's all day. They're back and forth on the lake there. And you have people who know gulls, and we're just stationed outside, lakeside, watching and pointing out things to people. So if you're intimidated to do this on your own, attending an event like this can help you see what others are seeing and kind of share in on what it is we're pointing out.
Is there a pre-registration for that?
Yeah, so it opens November 15th. Yeah, and you do have to register because we close registration after 150. We rent a yacht club, and the yacht club, we have lunch in there, we have a continental breakfast, we have a guest speaker, a couple of vendor tables. So it's an event, it's a whole deal. So you do have to register because we can't allow more than 150 people in the building. And most people will spend half the day outside, right outside the door, gull watching, and then when you get cold, you just come right inside to the yacht club and warm up. So it's a beautiful event. Very, very safe, very, very productive in terms of not just gulls, but also like diving ducks are going by all day. Raptors are going by. We sometimes have some winter finches in the background. So we're literally on the lakefront, on a boardwalk, and the yacht club is about a 20 to 30 foot distance from where you're birding. It's an
Awesome.
ideal setup. Yeah, it's an ideal setup. I look forward to seeing some of you there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for the tip. Because we do get on certain years, I would say late April, we'll get Bonaparte's gulls by the hundreds.
Yeah.
In certain ephemeral ponds that are around here. I've had them, and I just Bonapartes I think are kind of a beautiful bird to begin with, just watching them. So now that I know a little bit more, I'll see if I can come up with a little gull in there. So
Yeah. Oh yeah, you'll get one. You'll get one.
so with that, there again, we'll look for the book. Gull Frolic closes November 15th. So is the registration open now? Or is it
Registration, I'm sorry, registration opens November 15th.
opens? Okay. It opens November 15th. So put that on your calendar if you're interested. Sounds like a good time. Thank you so much.
Very welcome. Thank you.
It was great.
Appreciate the invite, guys. Always love talking about gulls, especially this
All right.
time.
With that, Amir, we're going to sign off. Take care, everybody.
Yep. Have a good one.